Professor Liza Zanotti, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. The first round results of Chile presidential elections revealed a striking 70% combined vote for right-wing candidates, despite only 24% going directly to José Antonio Kast. From a supply and demand side perspective, how do you interpret this extraordinary consolidation behind the far right? Does this reflect programmatic proximity among right-wing actors or an anti-incumbent punishment vote as seen in previous Chilean cycles?
Yeah, I believe it's both things. I do believe there's some voters of the far right who are heavily programmatic. I mean, they're in line with José Antonio Kast policy proposals, but there are maybe more voters that are more, sort of. I want to say anti-establishment, but they represent an anti-incumbent vote, which to me it's the majority of voters right now. I think we would make a mistake interpreting, for example, all the votes for Evelyn Matei as right-wing voters. There's a strong percentage, I do think, that vote for Evelyn Matei of people who don't really identify with the right, but were unhappy with the left-wing candidate belonging to the Communist Party. So I do think there's both like programmatic voters and dissatisfied voters.
Right. Given that Johannes Kaiser and Evelyn Matei endorsed Kast almost immediately, does the 2025 election signal the emergence of a more cohesive radical right bloc, or does it instead reflect strategic coalitioning that might fracture once governing begins?
I think it's, as I was saying before, there's a difference between the ones who voted for Kaiser, which I do think they're pretty much in line with Kast's proposals. I do think that Kast and Kaiser are pretty much similar candidates from the ideological point of view. The only difference in between them is the style. Kast is much more like a traditional conservative candidate, like close to, I don't know, Marie Le Pen sort of style, while Kaiser is much more like Donald Trump-like candidate, also much more performative, I would say. With respect to Evelyn Matei's voters, I do think there's a percentage of them, aligning with the center or the center left, which are dissatisfied, with Harak candidature. And in the case of José Antonio Kast government, I would say that Kast would align with him in backing him in all his policy proposal. And I would say that it's difficult to say what is the future of the center right in Chile, because it's true that Evelyn Matei backed José Antonio Kast pretty soon. I believe it was the same day of the election, but it's difficult to say how the parliamentary bloc would behave.
Right. Crime and immigration became the dominant issues of the presidential election campaign, mirroring your findings that Latin American PRR often substitutes authoritarianism for classical nativism. How does Kast's fusion of transnational crime and undocumented migration fit within or challenge your framework of authoritarian but not primarily nativist radical right parties in Latin America?
Yeah, when we wrote that article, a small caveat is that Chile was not in the sample. And I do believe that Chile is a partial exception in the sense that Kast has this like anti-immigrant discourse. And some studies found that anti-immigration views are determinant for voting for Kast. But I do think that in general, the authoritarian view, in the sense that conceiving society as structured in a certain way, in a normative way, would fit also Kast in this framework, because like it's sufficient to mention is like anti-liberal various views. So basically restricting the right for certain kind of civic minorities, like sexual minorities or certain kind of women, in which like married women are like for him and his political sector above, for example, feminist women or single women or women who don't have children. And I see the authoritarianism in Kast also in his view on security, in which the society needs to be ordered in a certain way, and the ones who disrupt this kind of order needs to be punished severely. So in his like conservative, extremely conservative views and his view on crime and the kind of punishment and the kind of like policies he wants to implement to stop the violence on the street, I would say I do see an authoritarian view.
Right. To what extent does the PRR's issue ownership on crime depend on perception gaps
I would say
crime rates? And let me finish the question. And how does this extend your research on authoritarian value orientations and their relationship to what choice?
Yeah, I would say that like a lot, just a short answer to your question, in the sense that, first of all, we do know that in comparative terms, Chile has still decent, I would say, comparing to the other countries in the region, decent numbers regarding crime. But clearly, people doesn't care about that. People do care about the fact that the situation has gone like worsening. And clearly there is a strong perception that the country has become really not safe. So I do think that Kast did and his sector did a really pretty good job in putting this at the center of the agenda, and the left didn't manage to put their issues, the issues they care about, at the center of agenda, such like the housing, which is a big problem here, not just in Santiago, but like in the rest of Chile also, and I would say in the rest of the Southern American countries. They didn't manage to put these kind of issues at the center of the agenda, and we ended up talking just about immigration and crime.
Right. Compulsory voting raised turnout to over 80%, activating a large pool of previously disengaged voters. Do your demand side findings suggest that these new voters are especially susceptible to anti-elite, populist, or authoritarian appeals? And how might this reshape Chile's longer-term political demography?
I would say that these voters are clearly disengaged. I could say that these voters clearly anti-establishment, and not caring that much about politics. They tend to vote for the candidate they think owns the agenda, basically. So as I was saying before, we ended up talking a lot about immigration and crime, and the right, and Kast specifically, is believed to be more competent and reliable on this kind of issues. So people who are disengaged and don't really care much about politics, they are drawn towards the more visible candidate, and in this case, it's been Kast. But I would add that it's not just Kast. The anti-establishment component of these people resulted also in a large vote share for Franco Parisi, who was the third candidate in the election.
Right. How should we understand Franco Parisi's unexpected third place performance, despite his anti-establishment techno-populist profile, in relation to your comparative work on negative partisanship, identity cleavages, and dissatisfaction with democracy?
Yeah, I would say that, as I was telling you before, like these people were drawn towards Franco Parisi candidature because of his anti-establishment posture. It said very time that he was neither a fascist, neither a communist. So he didn't play in this cleavage, communism versus fascism cleavage. He didn't position it willingly. Didn't want to enter this political battle and this cultural battle, I would say. And his discourse was really strongly anti-establishment, and he was able to get the vote of a lot of people who didn't really vote with before, and people who are disengaged from politics. So I think that it wasn't despite his anti-establishment discourse, it was because of his anti-establishment discourse that he managed to get in third in the competition.
Right. Kast's platform includes Bukele-inspired measures such as mass incarceration and military deployment. Based on your research on why citizens support democratic backsliding, what psychological or affective mechanisms make such proposals attractive to voters in an otherwise democratic and institutionally robust polity like Chile?
I think that all comes up to perception, as like you were saying before. I mean, people perceive the Bukele model as successful, which on some aspect it is, but people clearly don't see the other aspect, which is human rights violation. But I think in the case of El Salvador is sort of such specific case. And in the case of Salvador, people who, and there are a lot of studies about it, people who perceive themselves as democratic are willing to exchange security. I mean, they're willing to exchange democratic principle in exchange of more security, because they perceive that be secure, be safe on the street, it's part of the democratic premises. And I think the Kast did a really good job in convincing people that this model is somehow exportable to Chile, which we do know that it's not the case because of the many studies at the very specific type of criminal organizations that exist in El Salvador, which is not the same that exists in Chile, for the specific type of dealings that Bukele could reach with the maras, and here is just not doable. So people don't see that, and it's just the appeal, I would say, of the model who from the outside seems successful, I would say.
Right. Do you see the 2025 election as strengthening or weakening Chile's democratic guardrails, especially considering the constitutional memory of authoritarianism and the preventive strength of this party system?
I would say it's hard to say, but we do know from comparative experience that the far right, when it's in government, it erodes democratic principle and democratic institution from within. Let's just look at Hungary. Let's just look at Poland, for example. The far right in government for that many years starting to, erode from within. So it's not going to be that today we are in democracy and tomorrow we're gonna be in an authoritarian regime just from like a day to another, but it's gonna be if the far right it's gonna stay in power, gonna get to power and stay in power for a long time, for sure. Comparative experience show us that like there is a sort of democratic erosion.
Right. Kast has increasingly softened his explicit references to the Pinochet era while mobilizing nostalgia for order and discipline. Does this represent a strategic moderation, a normalization of authoritarian signifiers, or a deeper reframing of Pinochet's legacy within contemporary right-wing identity politics?
I would say the first one. I do think that Kast was very able not to talk too much about Pinochet and his regime. I do think, and we do know that he endorses. And I do think that Kast was helped a lot to be seen as more, mainstream and moderate by the candidacy of Kaiser, which it's a candidacy much more, visible and performative, and Kaiser sounds much more radical than Kast. Again, they're ideologically very similar. It's just a performative act that may, induce voters to think that Kast is more moderate and helping him, attract more votes, basically.
Right. In your work on classifying Latin American PRR parties, you note that the resonance of nativism varies regionally. Could Pinochet era order nostalgia function as a functional substitute for stronger nativist frames in the Chilean radical right?
Yes, but I do think there's some voters that are like basically authoritarian, so they believe that a strong candidate as Kast is presenting himself would restore the order, the old order, as the old Pinochet era. But I do think that there's a more pragmatic voter also, that it's not nostalgic necessarily, but does need and want more order, less immigration, and a better economic performance, especially in the middle class. I do think that we are underestimating the economic vote and the perception that this government right now perform very poorly in the economic realm. So especially from the lower middle class, I would think that the economic vote is strong, and it's a pragmatic vote more than a nostalgic vote.
Kast's discourse mixes populist anti-elite messages with strongly conservative moral rhetoric and market orthodoxy. Does this hybridization indicate an emerging Latin American variant of PRR populism, or does it remain closer to a European-style ideological triad like authoritarianism, populism, nativism?
I would say the Latin American far right, populist radical right, tends, in the economic realm, tend to be neoliberal. I would say that every PRR leader now in Latin America is neoliberal, but it's because the right in Latin America has a trajectory of like neoliberalism is strong ideology for the right in general in Latin America. I wouldn't say it's just a Latin American variant because, for example, if we look at Vox in Spain, I would say has like pretty much the same ideology. They're strong on conservative values. And also they are heavily, I would say, neoliberal. So I would say it's like a sub-variant of the PRR. It's like, it's a really strong conservative values, and we do see that some PRR in Europe are not really. They like don't really care about social values. I would say that the PRR in Latin America is much less interested in immigration, maybe besides Chile. But this is just because, the great replacement theory couldn't like work here because like the kind of immigration that the country received are pretty much homogeneous in a racial sense. So you cannot say that basically they're replacing our culture. I would say that even for Kast, the kind of anti-immigration discourse he holds is pretty much on the economic side. I mean, like the discourse that we don't have enough jobs and we don't want other people from outside coming here and like steal the job from the Chilean. And the exclusion is based on pretty much on civic values. I mean, the different kind of culture, but not culture in the ethnic sense, culture in more civic sense, no? So Venezuelan come here and they have other, a different way of life, no? So that's why we are excluding them. So I would say it's a variant. I wouldn't say it's completely a Latin American variant.
Right. How do you evaluate the moment-building capacity of Kast coalition, given the relatively weak institutionalization of right-wing parties in Chile compared to the long-lived PRR parties in Europe?
But in Latin America, the whole happened really quickly. I do believe that the first Latin American far-right leader got elected with Bolsonaro, and it was just, I don't know, 7 years ago. Yeah, it was 2018. So from 2018 up until now, 7 years, we have a lot of PRR or far-right leaders in power. We do have some countries in which the far right is strong electorally, but not yet in power. So it's with the presidential system, I do believe that, it's much quicker and the far right can get a lot more power, executive power, I mean, with respect to Europe, in which with parliamentary democracy, I mean, it takes more time in order to build, a coalition for the far right. And if we do look at Western European countries, I mean, in most cases, the far right is the minority leader of the government, except I do believe Italy. Italy is the main exception in which the far right basically it's in power with two parties, and there is a still small center-right, mainstream right party in government. But really, the government, we could say the government it's a far-right government. So in Latin America, with the presidential system, it's much easier, at least at the executive, for the executive branch, for these leaders to take power.
Right. Kaiser, Parisi, and Kast all relied heavily on digital mobilization, bypassing legacy media. How does this expansion of online efficacy relate to your findings on political participation and disaffection? Does digital populism systematically empower the radical right more than other actors?
I do think there's evidence that far right or populist radical right leaders use digital media for campaigning much more than other parties. And I think there's pretty much evidence that they somehow or sometimes do that with using misinformation and disinformation, meaning spreading sometimes news that are factually false. So I do think that this has, this had a role, but I do think that for with respect to the Chilean election, I do think that with respect to Parisi especially, the bulk of his vote was voters that were disengaged, not necessarily talking on social media and on mainstream media about politics, not really interested about politics. So just having a really strong anti-establishment view. So I don't think it was just like a strong factor, neither for Parisi nor for Kast.
Right. The rightward turn in Chile parallels broader regional shifts in Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, and potentially Peru. How should we interpret Chile's first-round election outcome within the fourth wave of radical right diffusion you analyze? Does Chile confirm or challenge regional patterns of PRR emergence?
I do think that Chile is pretty much in line with the shift we are witnessing, towards in many countries towards far right governments. I do think that Kast at this point is going to win the second run, and is going to join the club of far right leaders already in government. Next year we have elections in Peru. And the far right leaders is leading the polls for now. So I do think there is a shift, but again, I don't see this shift as as an ideological shift necessarily. I do think that the shift has a strong component of anti-elite and rejection of the incumbent, in which in many cases in Latin America were like left-leaning leaders. So I do think there's both, but I do think that ideology by itself does not explain this shift in Latin America.
And lastly, Professor Zanotti, if Kast wins the presidency, do you expect Chile to experience episodic, contained, or structural democratic backsliding? Which institutional, social, or attitudinal variables, based on your research, will be most decisive in shaping Chile's trajectory over the next decade?
As I was saying before, I don't think that the erosion will happen like in a short period of time. I would think that we first we do need to see if the far right is going to get to power, which seems possible, and then for how many years or how long it's going to stay in power, and also the parliamentary support. We already know that like the Congress is pretty much divided, We do know that the left, the center left and the left did better in the parliamentary election than in presidential election. So again, it would depend on different variables, but I do think that if the comparative experience we do have, that when the far right is in power for a long period of time, democratic backsliding happens.
Professor Lisa Zanotti, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.